Jonathan Larson's Rent just hit its 25th anniversary because the march of time is never ending, and everything is colored by our understanding of our own encroaching mortality. So let's take a look at what made Rent such a unique cultural phenomenon, and why so few other shows ever reach that level. Welcome to Derek Writes Plays, the channel for theater kids of all ages and the people who tolerate them. I am the titular Derek, and there is no day but today to hit the like and subscribe buttons. I am kidding, of course. Push them any day you like. Just, push them. Now, Rent is not the perfect play, and over much of the intervening 2.5 decades, many have argued with various amounts of sincerity that it is in fact a highly seriously flawed play, the 2005 film adaptation exposing many of those cracks to a larger audience. The thing that is easy to forget is that Rent is forever stuck in workshop. The unfortunate passing of Jonathan Larson both added to the mystique of the play in a 90s rock star sort of way, but also limited its evolution severely. We'll never know if he planned to clean up some of the clunkier dialogue or even replace songs that weren't hitting right, or if he really was that committed to that whole cow thing. Now, there are 5 aspects of Rent that truly make it a unique phenomenon in the history of theater. Number 1 is the right show at the exact right time. Number 2, it had characters and themes that directly spoke to the audience that was watching it. Number 3, it used the music of the moment. Every song here definitely sounds like the mid-90s. Number 4, it captured the zeitgeist and the cultural imagination. And 5, this is a show that got passed down. My brother gave his copy of the album to me. He passed it down from a Gen Xer to a Gen Yer, so I loved it because he did. Rent is the show that we can think of when we want to pinpoint Generation X. It is the culture of the time, frozen in ember. It was written by someone to commemorate the people that they knew and loved and lost in a particular place and time, and that is a feeling that we connect to. Now, as I mentioned, I'm a member of Generation Y. We do not have that. Much like job security and a housing market, a strong cultural identity has always seemed to sort of pass us by. Shows like Dear Evan Hansen and Be More Chill are already adapting the concerns of those born in the 21st century and giving them representation, but trying to find that for millennials just further proves how special Rent is. For example, Wicked is possibly the next generational defining musical that would come out, and it certainly captured the imagination, but it was not the music of the moment. These were old show tunes, as well written and catchy as they are, and it was set in a fantastical place. It wasn't speaking to the direct time and people that would be watching it, so it's not going to be the same. And in so much as capturing the culture of the time, I suppose you could argue that at this time most of our cultural currency was based on regurgitating old culture. If you were a child of the 90s, you might remember books such as The True Story of the Three Little Pigs, or the not so politically correct fairy tales, or the Stinky Cheese Man. So we were taking old things and old fairy tales and making them new again, and so this certainly does fall along with that trajectory, but really all that would say is that our culture is so bankrupt that we have to just continuously regurgitate old ones, which is true. So if Rent is using more of the sound of the 90s, that grunge and early electronica, then the next play that really comes out and encapsulates the sound of the early 2000s would probably be Spring Awakening with the Duncan Sheik soundtrack. Now, this, I would say, is the music of the moment at that time, a little bit folky, a little bit emo-y, so it definitely sounds like the time that it came out. It's a bit anachronistic because they're using modern music to tell a story set in like 19th century Germany, and those themes and characters and what they go through is still relevant in just about any time period. But again, not setting it in the modern time with modern characters does limit how affecting it is in that Rent sort of way. It's not a voice of the generation because it's talking about any generation, particularly a generation from 200 years ago in a whole different place. And unless you're Ted Mosby trying to drum up interest in a dying theater department, then you're not passing Spring Awakening down as much as you would be passing down Rent. Now, there are obviously parallels between Rent and Hamilton, in that both are huge hits and cultural milestones. And much like Rent was written by someone right next to Gen X, Hamilton's written by Lin-Manuel, who's right there on the cusp of being a Gen Y. So that lines up, and obviously the music is of the moment and easy to pass down and spreads like wildfire. But I would say Hamilton is actually closer to being the new Les Mis because Hamilton is set in the past. It can't be overstated that Rent was set in the here and now. It was speaking to the time that it was being watched. It was current. In the Heights might be closer to being considered the new Rent because it is set in the modern time, but unfortunately the success of Hamilton makes In the Heights less shareable somehow. It didn't penetrate as much because we were all waiting for Hamilton. Something that does have cultural cachet relevant to Generation Y is Come From Away. Now, one of the things that sets off a millennial from a Gen Z is that millennials were around and have vivid memories of 9/11. Come From Away, obviously set in the aftermath of 9/11, is using music that is relevant to modern time. So setting-wise, Come From Away is actually really close to nailing that same Rent button. And I believe that the composing team is pretty close in age. Maybe again, like a Lin-Manuel, maybe just like a few years off from being a definite millennial, but right there on the cusp. Time will tell if this starts being passed down the way that a Rent would, if Gen Y is really passing their copies of the album down to Gen Z. We'll see, but until then we won't know. But Come From Away, at least is something culturally close, but again, not quite there. Now, I like to joke that the new Rent is actually the SpongeBob Musical. Hear me out. What's the one most lasting thing created in the late 90s, early 2000s? Probably SpongeBob SquarePants. So you have a relevant culture, and the themes of the play are actually pretty much spot on to the struggles of a millennial. You have an environmental catastrophe and a government that you can't trust, and you have a character who solely wishes that they were middle management. Like, that would be a step up for them. So those are all pretty hard-hitting millennial themes, and the music being every song composed by a different band is pretty spot on as well, because nowadays we make playlists out of singles. We don't listen to albums. Millennials killed the album, as they say. So the idea of having each song as a different single is pretty spot on as well. I firmly believe that SpongeBob is pretty close to being the Rent of Generation Y, and what does that say about my generation? But the real closest thing to Rent for Generation Y, besides SpongeBob, might actually be, in a similar vein, Avenue Q, because you're taking, again, something relevant to the culture. We grew up watching Muppets and Sesame Street, so that's something that is relevant to us. And the themes of being a new graduate and trying to find your place in the world and struggling with that. The music, not so much of a relevant part, again, going more back to being show tunes, but they sort of sound like Sesame Street music, Sesame Street songs. So it ties into the theme of the show. But here is what is most important about Avenue Q. I said Rent was passed down from one person to another. Avenue Q is the first memed musical. If you were on the internet at the time of You're the Man Now, Dog, and Newgrounds, you have heard a large portion of the Avenue Q soundtrack. It was passed down. It was made accessible and shared. So for that reason and that reason alone, Avenue Q might be Generation Y's Rent. Again, not counting SpongeBob. Now that exercise might have seemed a little irrelevant to the subject on hand, but actually, I believe that it does show why Rent was so powerful, so unique. No other show can hit all 5 of those things. No other show was culturally relevant, using the music of the time, talking about themes and characters that were relatable to people in the audience at that time, that captured the zeitgeist so completely and was so easily and readily passed down from one generation of theater kid to another. So if you are a Gen Z theater kid, please tell me what soundtracks are being passed down to you. What is the group above you recommending? What are you seeing them? What is the song that your older brother or sister loves that makes you then love that musical too? What are we sharing with the next generation and getting them excited about? And speaking of sharing, be sure to like, subscribe, and share this video. Maybe we'll do go more in depth on the show itself in a future episode, but I just want to touch on those 5 aspects, things that I think were important and that I don't think we really talk about enough. This has been Derek Writes Plays. I have been the titular Derek, and until next time, peace and all good.